I guess actually before we even get into the panel, it might be good is for you both just to briefly introduce yourselves so that people kind of know who you are in your context and where you're coming from in terms of the work you're doing.
So I'm Eyal Goshani. I head up the data science team at Vevo. Vevo is one of the largest distributor of music. If you watch a music video on YouTube, it's most likely a Vevo music clip.
Yeah.
And I am Matt Cornett. I'm the Senior Director for Data Operations and Tools at The Gap. And most people have probably heard of The Gap. My team's really responsible for creating the environment for data science to happen at scale.
The theme of the panel is how to partner with IT. And the way I think about it is there's some relationships that always have friction, like Democrats and Republicans or cats and dogs or sales and marketing. And when I talk to people out in the field, prospective Domino customers and Domino customers, I sometimes hear about this friction between IT and data science, where IT wants to lock things down, they don't want flexibility, and the data scientists want to be free. And it's interesting because obviously you need both those constituencies to work well together in order for the business to actually reach the objective. And so I guess my first question would be to say, just maybe react to the thesis. Like, do you see that in your organization? And if so, why? And what do you think is happening?
Yes, you do. I think it's a different organization. It happens for different reasons. So previous life worked at Sony, and over there was back in the days where people actually have their own data center. And yes, DevOps will try to lock down the resources, but it's mainly just to more from the perspective of it's a shared resource, and obviously they don't want data scientists or hogging up all the CPU and compute resource to run models. That's becoming less and less the point these days with AWS and things migrating over to the cloud. These days probably is more contention around getting airtime with DevOps to actually go and spin up resources and allocate and configure and enable the work that data science really does. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I would say from my perspective, I really see kind of three components. One is a lack of understanding of what data science actually is and where it intersects with kind of BI and reporting and where it doesn't. I think a lot of IT views us as a reporting team, which is a threat to their reporting tools and structures. I would say second is from an information security point of view, particularly in our organization. We are very zealous about protecting customer information and privacy. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to lock people away from using the data. That's the best way to keep it safe, is to lock it away and never use it, right? And then the third really comes from, just, kind of resourcing. And prioritization, and not viewing data science and analytics, as a core competency or strength of the organization.
So given that, and especially them not understanding and the territorial thing, what are some of the strategies that you've tried to use to break that down? Or how do you get them to lower the defenses and open up?
I'd say the number one is actually empathy. So really understanding where the IT organization is coming from, and then approaching the problem, the communication back to them in that way. So if it's a lack of understanding, let me teach you what data science actually is. Let me show you an example of a Python program or an R program and the models that we're creating and where we integrate it and how it affects the customer all the way at the very end. I've found that to be an effective strategy, and really telling the story instead of coming in and saying we need this technology to build a model and to leave it as an abstract structure like that. I'd like to really connect it to a business result and to a customer experience.
Yeah, I think particularly the last sentence about connecting it to business outcome. One of the ways of tackling some of that barrier issues is, pick a use case that can help IT and actually work with them towards solving that problem. Once they can actually see what the process looks like and the fact that you can actually help them achieve their own goals, they become more and more bought in. As they become more bought in, they can lower the defenses and help you out in the process because they become part of the force that evangelize on your behalf to drive that change.
Got it. Going beyond IT, at the very beginning of this thing, I was talking a little bit about like which organizations are model driven and which ones are lagging or not getting there. And part of what you're saying actually leads into that, which is that many organizations don't really understand what data science can do for them. And that people have their departmental mission or their job responsibility, and they don't think about the broader thing about the company imperative. And then this net new and different thing called data science comes along. I'm curious, do you have ideas? So partnering with IT is part of that, but there's other constituencies you may want to have that same partnering relationship with. Have you had any success, or how do you sell to like executives in terms of like, this is why data science should change X within the business?
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, it's a lot of external case study. So here's what X company did, and here was their outcome. And really telling the story and then tying that to something that we're doing internally. So if, let's say, let me just use a current example, and I'm totally making this up, by the way. But I was reading over here on my Uber ride over here, an article on Wired that published today about Stitch Fix, which is a big competitor to the Gap, and how they've hired 100 data scientists to create all these personalization algorithms. Okay, well, we need to do the same thing if we're going to be competitive. So that's the story I want to tell. We need to invest in data science capabilities because we've got other more modern companies that are eating our lunch because we're not doing the same thing. We're not able to provide the same types of recommendations as a company like Stitch Fix because we're not putting the right infrastructure in place to be able to do data science.
It's a really difficult question to answer. So a couple of ways I tend to look at it. First one is the top down and bottom up, or how do you tackle the top down and how do you tackle the bottom up. Top down, there's a fair amount of education that needs to be done for executives to actually understand data science. One of the most depressing compliments I ever got as a data scientist is quite recent, actually. I was saying that Eyal, you're the first head of data science that can actually make data science explainable to me, that I can actually understand your work, which is a nice compliment to have, but it's also quite depressing to think that before that, the executives don't really understand what data scientists do. They know it's really cool, it's hip, and it's in the news, but they didn't really understand what it actually does. So part of the role as a leader of data science in the organization is to break it down and make it relatable again to the business issue, so the executive can actually see the value that you can bring to the organization, and then they become your advocates as well, and they in return seek more advice on how to make the organization a lot more data driven. And it's one of the biggest challenge in data science that I don't see it discussed as often enough, which is there's a whole generation of executives that essentially still come from the old world and haven't fully internalized that we're in the process of a major shift. And not surprisingly, when you ask someone like myself, I see that the data science now plays a completely different role where they're actually the core of the organization, because now they're not only there to generate models, but they're also there to almost put like a semi-product hat and actually advise on how to better build your product, because the outcome of some of those models actually will drive decisions on how a product should be built. They're there to provide advice on how the business should operate. So they really are the core of what you do as an organization. So in many respects, you very slowly have to change the mindset of your executives to put data science at the core of it and actually restructure the entire business around data science. It's not trivial, and it takes time, and oftentimes you have to recognize that certain companies are just not going to be able to make that transition, and essentially they'll become the dinosaur you had in that diagram.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, especially what you said about the Stitch Fix thing, because a lot of organizations, I get the feeling they read that article and they're like, oh my God, we must do data science. I remember talking to one guy who said they had an objective, one of their OKRs for the year was to machine learn on their data. And I was just like, what does that mean? And he's like, we were told we have to machine learn the data. And I'm like, I can't help you. Although I could have sold him a Domino, but he didn't want it. But it's interesting because it's I can imagine then there's this one level of like getting IT to buy into your objective. There's this much harder task of getting an organization to reorganize around that. And I wonder how much, when I think about like Deal or Tire and the example of an organization that actually has a quota on the data science team, how good do you all think you are? Maybe this is like a question for the whole room of quantifying the value of the investment in data science to say like, we delivered a revenue uplift or a cost reduction or something like that. Like, is that part of your dialogues?
No, but it should be. But it's incredibly difficult to do in a lot of circumstances because what we're really doing, is in our team has two dual missions. One of them is to power customer experiences with data. And that one's a little bit easier to kind of figure out, that ROI component. Because if we're personalizing something on the website, we can A/B test it and figure out how much incremental revenue it's driving. Our second mission is to make better decisions with data. And that's a very wide-ranging mission. And that one's a lot harder to quantify. So if I'm trying to convince a senior vice president to use the results of some analysis for a decision that she's trying to make, it's not necessarily something that we can instrument where we can A/B test it and figure out what that incremental value is. So it's really hard to characterize the value of data science in that way.
Mm-hmm.
From my perspective, for the most part, I try to actually quantify in really three different ways. First one is how much money can the organization make by adopting a certain product or approach, how much money they can save, and what sort of risk we can mitigate. Sometimes it's a combination of all three, but yeah, for the most part, every project that I do, I tend to justify it in those three ways, and obviously overlay with amount of effort and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, for the most part, I do try to measure things.
Okay, and people respond to that like they expect you'd come in and say.
Executives very much respond to that, yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what they look for. Yeah. Great. Let me do this. I kind of want to open it up to the room for questions or for you to each other if you have questions. Questions from the room.
Can you expound at all at, is it Vevo?
Yeah.
How you quantify that ROI? I'm interested to hear, because that's a hard problem, as Matt said, to often do. Do you have any things that best practices that you found that work well for you?
Certain things are easier than others, yes. So if we do experimentation, for example, in a YouTube environment, and you experiment with certain elements of the YouTube video that you can optimize, then you can actually turn the ROI on how much effort and cost it took you to actually build an experimentation platform versus the return that came out of the optimization process itself. So that becomes once you actually have the cost versus how much money you can make, you can do a pretty rough ROI calculation. Later on, when you actually justified your experimentation platform, and if it's already matured and it's all gravy from there, the more experiment you run on it, you can just already leave the cost behind, and it just becomes more of a what else can we do we've already spent the time and effort building this, what else can we do and optimize?
Okay, let me ask you another question then on back to the IT thing. Thank you. So on the IT thing, the other thing I think about a little bit is in terms of ROI, there's project-based ROI of like, we're going to do this thing and it's going to be this result. But there's also like the cost of DevOps. We need to retrain a model, and we can retrain it quarterly or weekly or things like that. And so there's even a harder thing because you're asking people to do more work for something that's already been done, so to speak. And they may say, hey, you already built that model. You already put it into production. Like, why are you coming back again? How do you manage that? Is that a friction point or?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually, it's interesting that you asked that because that's actually how I was able to get Domino in the door and be able to make that investment was exactly around that process. So formally, it used to take us about, I think about $80,000 in about 8 weeks to put a model into production. So the data science team way over separate would create their model and then they would hand it off to the IT team to re-implement, which was basically recoding it in Java. And as part of that, we had to spin up a project and get it funded, and typically about $80,000. To get that done. So we talked about that investment and it really wasn't even about the dollar investment. It was about the time to market, where we could now put a model into production after it's done, really within a matter of minutes, best case. And that was a really useful strategy in being able to get Domino in the door. I would say the other thing that's not entirely related, but also a really useful strategy for me was, creating, and it was kind of like what we were talking about, what John was talking about, creating an open environment for our data scientists, but in a governed, controlled space. So IT still owns the servers, but data science is handling what's happening inside of those servers, inside of the Domino application. So it's a safer environment and easier to shut down if something goes wrong. And that was also a really useful argument to make with IT. Here, we're going to help you work better because you're going to give us better technology. I always found that to be a helpful argument as well.
Okay. So, I'm curious about Vevo because actually I watch a lot of videos with my kids on YouTube and, Taylor Swift videos. It's all Vevo. So when you talk about like working with the product team and influencing product decisions, and probably for you too, how much do they feel like you're a partner of them, or do they feel like you're kind of like coming into pushing your way in? Like how do you get people to let you tell them possibly what to do?
Very sensitive topic. So sometimes it's a partnership, sometimes it's perceived as a threat. So and it comes down to cultural, and it comes down to the person on the other side as well. So if the idea is without a partner and help each other out to build the best product you can build, it'll end up being a partnership where during the design stage it'll be data science taking the front lead in the design via experimentation. And then during the implementation and productionization stage, the data scientist will take a back seat and essentially becomes a support role for the PM to lead the productionization stage. That to me is a well-functioning relationship that works really well. I've seen the project executed really well when it's done correctly. On the other hand, there could be other projects that I've seen that didn't work well because of the perceived threat of I'm product, I should know how to do this, don't tell me how to do my job. And obviously that's not the case. I'm not there to essentially tell people how to do the job. It's just more like providing a scientific framework on how to develop a product. So obviously you have to manage that relationship a little bit differently, and then spend a lot of time on change management, getting a relationship where there's enough trust in there, and then hopefully work towards a relationship where to understand why you want to do things in a very measured scientific way, come up to a conclusion on what's the best way to build a product, made it a data-driven or model-driven decisions, and only then actually go and execute it, and actually not worrying about these things and only following the product methodology of building a product that doesn't necessarily going to be successful because there's no insight behind it.
Yeah, so we've actually got something kind of similar to this going on right now. I don't know if anybody else here works with a retailer, but merchants and planners really use a lot of their intuition and their experience to make decisions around what products they're going to buy, the quantities, and for us, the profile of the sizes of each product. So what we're doing now is we've built some new models that are helping to predict what those size profiles should be. And we've been having a hard time getting the planners to adopt them. So what we're doing now is we're building a tool that's going to say, here's what the prediction said, here's what you did, and here's what actual was. So we're kind of laying out all three of those components in the same visual to help them understand how the models can help them make better decisions. And that's the first part on a journey where we're hoping to get the endpoint is the models are making the decisions and the humans are just looking for anomalies. That's going to be a long journey for sure. But for right now, just helping them understand where their blind spots are, I think is going to be useful. I'll let you know in about 6 months.
I just want to say, so what you're saying is you're going to have a graph that says, like, this is what you said, and here's how you were wrong. It's like...
I would only characterize it like that within these four walls.
Yeah.
But yes.
No, but it's like that is a really tough thing. But I think that's the right thing.
But this is happening across the industry where algorithm can make more consistent and better decision day in and day out, and people have to come to the realization that they're going to have to take a backseat to the algorithm and become the custodian of the algorithm rather than being replaced by it. So it behooves us as data scientist leaders to actually educate them on what that process is and find a way of doing it in such a way that doesn't perceive it as a threat, or rather we're there to help them out.
Yeah, I think it's the metaphor of the backseat or the custodian is the thing that just feels bad. It's like you want them to find their special power that the model can't do. And that may be harder for some things which are easily quantified.
Yeah, but you're more than comfortable using GPS to navigate your way around town.
Ask my wife.
Eventually you become, once you start using things and you start adopting it, it's about change management. Well, once you start using certain things and you realize how comfortable it is, you're very comfortable using those tools, and it just becomes a completely different discussion. So.
Yeah, and it's also about getting the humans to recognize that they can move up the value chain instead of spending their effort on kind of those lower level decisions. We can let the computers do that, and then have them focus on more higher order decisions, the more creative types of decisions, as opposed to how should t-shirt sizes be distributed.
All right. Oh, question in the back? You can yell it out and I'll repeat it.
So you mentioned having models making decisions and then humans handling the anomaly detection. How do you make sure that people don't get too comfortable in the backseat and still take on kind of the responsibility of detecting anomalies?
That's a great question, and it's not something I have an answer to, quite frankly. And I think that's part of the journey is to figure that out, and figure out where the models are going to make the best decisions, where the humans are going to make the best decisions, and what that interaction is. And I think that's actually the next phase of the journey for most data science teams that are starting to go down this same path. Replacing the intuition-based decisions with data-driven decisions, and it's probably a journey to get there. It's probably not we're going to turn this thing on tomorrow, and all of a sudden the models are making the decisions. It's we're giving them better information for the humans to make the decisions, and then incrementally we end up at the place where they're looking for something really crazy that the models are outputting because we're missing a parameter somewhere that just doesn't make sense, and we've got to go back and revisit the models.
An example I can use probably for my previous company is I worked for a mobile cybersecurity company, and we developed a machine learning algorithm to detect malware. And there were a lot of experts out there that actually dissect malware manually, and there was a lot of resistance on adopting machine learning because they was perceived that it's not going to provide the same value added as an expert. So the approach that I took there is start with somewhere where it's safe. So I've implemented the ML to work on a certain area of the malware catalog that is considered to be low threat, and nobody really cared. So the volume was so high there that the ML could do a major amount of heavy lifting, where humans just didn't have the appetite or the will to go into before. And that provided a lot of visibility is what the ML can do and how it can actually help in an environment which is fairly safe. And also you can actually do a hindsight analysis and see how much, what's the false positive rates, false negative, and all that sort of stuff. And you can also put guardrails around it as well, which is whenever you build a classifier, you just put some guardrail depending on your appetite for risk as an organization. So obviously you can make it a bit more aggressive if your appetite for risk is greater and vice versa. And yeah, that was probably my first real foray into how to deal with that exact issue.
And then so did you use that to then show the experts that the algorithm was better? I mean, I can imagine that.
I think it's a conclusion they are of themselves, but it's there to help them out, and you can actually there's so much malware out there, and it's just beyond, you just can't build an army of experts to sit there and catch malware. And this was the first time it's dawned on them that, yes, they're going to have to rely on ML to do a lot of the heavy lifting.
Okay. Other questions?
Matt, going back to your example of the assortment with the demand planner, a lot of times when you have a conversation about evangelizing data science in your org, you might be able to convince sort of the next person, but how do you get them to sort of go evangelize it for you even further to help, so that you or your team are not necessarily always responsible for getting that value?
You make them look good. Make them help them to make better decisions that they can then show their boss and say, hey, this was really cool because I did this X% better because I had this support behind me.
What I found to be very effective is the notion of you build it, you present it. So I tend to hire data scientists who are excellent communicators. And a recent example being a town hall being a really good place to actually showcase some of the data science work. And obviously knowing the diversity of people who are in town hall, you have to break it down to lowest common denominator. So you have to present it in such a way that anybody in there can understand. I've had a case recently of somebody join my team, and within 3 months they were presenting in town hall and getting everybody excited about an upcoming data science project. So, pick a forum that is very visible to the organization, and make sure you spend the time to communicate the value that the organization brings in a way that actually is relevant to the stakeholders in the room, and they'll come and reach out for you afterwards.
For us, it feels like we've been kind of in this this dance with IT where we kind of have leaned on them, and they've built systems, and then they break, and there's a backlog, and they can't fix them, and then we try to do things on our own, and then they're not invested, and so they're upset about it, and there's kind of there's friction there. Right now, we're in a phase of trying to work more closely with IT. I'm just wondering if you've ever even entertained the idea of do we go it alone, or do we go with IT and sort of be all integrated and try to be on the same team? And if, obviously we're talking about working with IT, but I was just curious if either of you have ever been at that kind of a decision point and how you thought about it or made that decision and, executed.
Yes, absolutely. And that's actually part of what my team does. I don't want to call it a shadow IT organization. It's more of a supplement to areas where we can't get the right support. For instance, building things like data marts and other types of summary tools. I've got a team of data engineers that focuses on that, where traditionally that would be kind of an IT thing. And really the way that I position it is it's opportunity cost for IT. For them to come in and do a data mart, which they're going to have to spend 6 months gathering requirements, and then they're going to build it, and it's not going to be right, and we're going to have to iterate 6 or 7 times until anybody will actually use it. I push it down and I say, okay, well, we're going to prototype this for the next 6 to 12 months and iterate very rapidly. and then come out on the other end with a clean set of requirements for you to go and build. Now, if we ever get to that end part, I'll let you know. But that's typically the way that I kind of move in that direction. The other thing is, really kind of moving certain types of workloads away from them that they're not interested in supporting. So for us, it's data quality monitoring. We've had a really tough time getting IT to take data quality monitoring seriously. So on my team and my engineering team, we've built a lot of scripts that do that for us. So we'll call out problems to them as we find them, so they can just focus on the issue resolution instead of the identification and the resolution.
To me, it comes down to headcount and structure. So I think what you're describing is kind of a different take on the centralized versus decentralized in a different way. I've seen data science teams that are completely self-contained. They have their own sort of DevOps team, if you will, but then become completely siloed and detached from the business. I've seen the other way where they get all the support they need, but they become a big hog in terms of resources, and anywhere in the middle. Best advice I can give you is probably get the top-down endorsement from executive, but know that's going to be a journey rather than a destination, which means, advice I was given back in the days, anywhere from 12 to 15% of your workforce is data related. They'll give you an indication of, 12% is probably organizations who are fairly mature in nature. 50% are still building up. So know that you can do an assessment of whether you have enough skill set to be able to build and sustain whatever you need to do in the future, or whether you need to do a shadow type operation to justify the value in order to drive a decision down the track to do a proper investment and actually build it properly in a scalable way. You always want to sit down and build things properly and scalable and sustainable, but unfortunately it's like I've never seen a case of executives who are happy to go and write a big check and do the hard mile of what it actually means to do, proper data governance and all that sort of stuff.
At my company, one of the big things that data science facilitates is experimentation, A/B testing. And one of the difficulties has been getting locked into this kind of growth hacking mindset where we're trying to just optimize a little bit with sort of every A/B test, as opposed to sort of taking big bets that might change the product very substantially and sort of reach some kind of global optimum in terms of what the product can be, as opposed to kind of sort of finding new local optima. How do you sort of think about that in terms of sort of moving from relying on A/B testing to sort of more judgment, where you might sort of have kind of larger outcomes?
You just got to be careful, because sometimes global optimal lies beyond the ability of a company to stay solvent, particularly when you're talking about startups. So we just got to be. Depends on the company, on the situation. The way I approach experimentation at Vevo is we've built a platform to be able to do experiments within our own ecosystem. And we're doing it in a very modular way. So at the moment we're focusing on certain elements of YouTube ecosystem, running experiments there about multiple different elements. But the system is built in such a way that if I later on want to expand it to other areas, I can actually do that fairly easily. So yeah, it's starting off small and then expanding as you need.
Yep, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's taking small bites, racking up wins, building credibility, and then kind of expanding the sphere of influence from there. It's really hard to, especially in a large organization, especially in a large 50-year-old organization, it's really, really difficult to do those big bang types of changes. So it's more incremental for us.
thank you both very much. I really appreciate you coming and sharing your thoughts and experience with us.
Sure.
And thank you.
Thank you.